Start the recording. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today during this particular check-in, we're going to be continuing our coverage of this particular unit. We're currently in module number 3. We've already covered psychophysics and physiological psychology. Now we'll be looking at evolution in psychology today. And as we've done on several occasions already, what we'll do is we'll just do a real quick review to remind ourselves of a couple of things. For today's agenda, again, the purpose of the meeting is to go over key information, provide you guys the opportunity to ask live questions. What we'll be doing is we'll be looking over what we've covered this week by providing sort of a summary overview. At this time, as you can see, using the chat feature, please send to me present so that I can go ahead and count you in. And when I start giving some points out for attending these sessions, I will be able to do so for you. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing today, focusing on that. And anytime if there is a question, you can go ahead and stop me or send a chat message for me to respond to it in that way. Okay, so where we are currently is we are going to be going over a few items. We're looking at the reminder of the course flow. We always are going to be looking at reading textbook chapters, completing the quiz homeworks, reviewing and annotating the lecture notes that are provided to you, and of course, view those video lectures and complete the discussions associated with them. I will add for now that there are a couple of people who are doing really well in the course, but a few individuals are missing some of the video lecture / discussion questions. I do that in order to sort of keep the debate and questioning and interaction going on the particular lectures, topics that we're having. So please be sure if you've missed any of those lecture discussions, please go back and go ahead and put some input into them. And of course, we have the videos as well from Crash Course in the School of Psychology that you are slated to view as well as some standalone discussions which are outlined normally in your syllabi. And of course, review sessions and the study guide in preparation for the module and unit test once we're there. We have a few more chapters that we're going through before we're ready for the next module test, but it will be chapter 10 and chapter 11 that will be covered next week. Okay. All right, so basically what we're doing today is we're going to be reviewing and summarizing some of the key items and topics from this chapter, chapter 9, on evolution and psychology. And let me go ahead and apologize real briefly. My allergies are acting up today, so if I start coughing or I have to beg out for a second or two, just bear with me. All right, so evolution and psychology. What we mean by evolution is the process by which different kinds of living organisms are thought to have developed and diversified from earlier forms during the history of the earth. So that's going to be the key driving topic that will be the focus of this particular chapter and how that has had some role in psychology. So many others have also came up with many ideas about species change in our history. We go all the way back to Aristotle, and he wanted to organize beings on some sort of scale so that it can be classified. He did this for minerals, plants, as well as animals, so they can be slotted into their proper place. George Buffon, his ideas that species change over time has become sort of the cornerstone of modern evolution theory. And then, of course, we've already talked about Goethe. He looked at each level of organism was based on a fundamental primitive plan or archetype from which the more complex features in organisms develop. So many people, well before Darwin and some of the figures that we'll be talking about today, before they came up with their ideas of evolution, how evolution actually works, there are many others who touched on these basic ideas. Now, in the early conjecture on these things of evolution, some saw evolution as part of God's design to, and again, we see this focus back on God here in order to maintain the specialness of humanity. And we've seen this pop up a time or two in previous chapters. The one that comes to mind most readily is going to be the geocentric versus the heliocentric model of the universe, whether or not the Earth is the center of the universe or not. So in the early development of these ideas, hundreds of years ago, we always wanted to have humanity be somewhat special in some way. And so this is one of the ways in which that was done, by saying it's part of God's design. Now, Herbert Spencer, he is credited with bringing the idea of evolution to psychology. And some of the things that influenced his ideas and works were his work with embryology, the development of organisms. So once they are conceived, they go through various stages of development. And it was through those various stages of development that he was able to observe that he came up with some of his ideas about evolution. And what he saw primarily is, for him, evolution was less sophisticated and undifferentiated organisms develop into more sophisticated and differentiated organisms. So he saw that from the more simple to the more complex. He saw that as the driving force behind this evolution. That was what was going on. Now, one of the key things is that Spencer saw this whole process as a materialistic and a natural phenomenon. So basically, he was going away or shying away from the idea that a deity had to have their hand involved in this particular process, that this is something that just naturally occurs and there's no need for a deity to be involved in this particular process. So here we see the early establishment of some of the basic ideas that sort of lead us to the modern incarnation of evolution that we'll be seeing as we go through some of these slides. So, looking more at Herbert Spencer, since it was he who brought the ideas of evolution to psychology, let's look at his conception of psychology. First, Herbert Spencer's views of consciousness or mentality. We see that he saw this inner aspect and this outer aspect, and he saw that sort of combining to this one thing that he saw as nature. And this was the same substance. So we saw this as being made of the same stuff, but have slightly different perspectives. And this is similar to the idea that we saw previously of the double aspect view that we saw, I think, initially with Spinoza. So he sees this inner mental world, and then he looks at it, compare it to the nervous system activity. So we have the non-material mental world, and then we have the physical world represented by the nervous system. And so what he did here was sort of try to communicate the following idea, that as the nervous system changes, as the physiology of the nervous system changes and evolves, so does the mental state. So here he's drawing a correlation to the idea that as the physiology of the nervous system of organisms change, that also produces a change in their mentality, the mental states that they go through as well. Therefore, if that's the case, you would see the following, that organisms with simple feelings, can lead to or evolve into organisms with more complex feelings. Organisms that go from primitive states of consciousness can evolve into more complex states of consciousness. So what we're seeing here is the notion that when we're talking about evolution, as Spencer saw it, he was not just talking about the physiological changes in an organism or species. He's talking also about the mental consciousness changes as well. So the mind's basic states are put together via associations into more complex states. And we've seen this idea pop up a time or two in our conversations as well. The notion that we have these simpler ideas, these simpler forms of things, and then they combine together and associate with one another in ways to make more complex ones, more complex states. So we see this idea being offered up here by Spencer as he looks at how these ideas of evolution can play a role in psychology. So the key to this then leads to something that is important for us to understand about what these mental states actually do for us. This whole chapter in large degree is going to be about adaptation and changing based on trying to adapt to the environment. So mental states, okay, mental states that can be adaptive to the environment outlast and remain compared to those that are not adaptive that may disappear. So what this is basically saying is that those mental states which are advantageous to the organisms in dealing with their particular environment, those things will last. They will be around longer. They aid you in surviving, okay, allow you to adapt to the environment, and therefore they're going to have some sort of stick-to-itness. They'll be around. Okay, those organisms who do not have the proper mental states that are adaptive to the environment, again, as we'll see, one of the key factors of evolution is about survival and having offspring. What that basically means is that you have mental states which are not adapted to the environment. They may disappear because the people who have those particular mental states, they will not be able to successfully live long enough to successfully have offspring and things of that nature. So these mental states which are adaptive for us, the adaptation increases our chances of survival. And again, that's one of the key things that we're talking about here, about how is it that we survive. And so what he's suggesting here is that having certain types of mental states have allowed us to have greater chances of survival. Now, part of that would involve how we see the world. And this next bullet here, the mental world reflects the outer world. Think about what that is saying. It's saying that what you have by way of a mental representation in your mind has to have some sort of connection to what is out there in the real world. So mental world reflects the outer world. Again, if you had somebody who, let's say, have some sort of genetic form of psychosis all the time, and their mental world does not reflect the outer world, then they would not probably live as long. They would have more difficult time surviving. Okay, so the notion is that we see here why these mental states can be very adaptive for us in dealing with the environment. So going along the same lines as this mental world reflects the outer world, then we have this idea that a true idea, whatever the idea is that you are observing, corresponds more closely to external reality. So what you see that you may see as a threat is actually a threat to you in that environment. Again, that will be very useful to us in guiding our behavior, knowing who and what types of creature to avoid, all right, what to do. So when we see that type of creature, we avoid it. So the notion here is that the mental states can definitely have some sort of impact on our survivability. Again, recall too from intro psych, and we'll see this a little bit later, the ideas offered here about evolution and those offered by Darwin a little bit later, they had a great deal of influence on functionalism. Okay, how does psychology help us to function? Here, the question is a little bit more basic. How do mental states aid us in adapting to the environment? Now, in addition to the idea of mental states, this sort of previews some other concepts of what, as well, that you're probably somewhat familiar with. And that's going to be connectionism. Okay, connectionism. Learning is the formation of connections in the nervous system based on repetition of stimuli close in space and time. So as an organism repeats certain behavior, the neurons in the nervous system start to develop these neural networks and these connections, okay? And that connectionism is what is aiding in our survival. It aids us in learning. The other idea is going to be the law of effect. We usually associate this law of effect with Thorndike. And basically it says this: behavior that is followed by a pleasant consequences is likely to be repeated. So if we do something and we get something positive from it, something pleasant, we're more likely to do it again. And any behavior followed by an unpleasant consequences is likely to be reduced or to be stopped. So that's the basic idea and premise there. And we'll talk more about law of effect during this session, as well as a future one when we talk more specifically about behaviorism. So those are some of the things that are sort of setting the stage for some major ideas and major influences in psychology. Before I move to the next slide here, let me pause and see if there's anyone with any questions. And of course, I see that a few people have joined us since we started. Be sure to send me a message that you are present. All right, so is there anyone who has a particular question right now? Okay, good. No questions so far. So let's go ahead and keep rolling then. All right, so what we see then as we build this understanding of evolution, we then talk about animals, okay? And as we saw earlier, even with Rene Descartes, sometime before, he sort of opened the door for us to look at animals and to learn from them as well. So let's focus here on animal learning. And there's, quote, stamping in of a physical connection that associated a particular stimulus with a particular response into the nervous system. And so I was sort of alluding to this a little bit earlier, where we have some sort of stimulus in the environment and some sort of response becomes associated with it. And this has an impact within the nervous system. The stamping in is at some level a physical type of thing. Okay, so there's going to be some changes that occur in our neural activity. Okay, again, from learning, you may recall long-term potentiation, the idea of how these neurons sort of develop these connections, become more easily activated when these things happen. This stamping in occurs and we're actually learning stuff. And then we have stimulus response behaviorism. The idea that behavior is causally produced by stimuli in the environment, and that learning occurs through the creation and modifications of links between these environmental stimuli and behavioral responses. And of course, that should cause you to think quite a bit about behaviorism psychology, about operant conditioning, which we'll see later, as well as classical conditioning. And so what we're seeing here is the stimulus and the response behaviorism, they're saying, has some sort of impact on us. And that's what that next bullet talks about. Creatures or organisms are shaped by the environment. So the environment teaches us. We eat a red berry, that particular red berry makes us sick. Then we try to avoid that particular type of red berry in the future. And what they're suggesting here is that the relationship between the environmental stimuli and your behavioral responses also is having some sort of influence in your nervous system as well, with the stamping in. So psychologically, we have a collection of associations or relations that have been driven by the relations in the external environment. So the external environment has caused certain associations to occur within us. And so in that sense, they can say that the self is an aggregate of these associations, of these feelings, and these particular ideas. So again, we see the precursor to a lot of behaviorism psychology that we'll be touching on a little bit further later in the course. All right, so the next thing that this leads us to is Spencer and Lamarck. So what we've seen so far is the idea that evolution impacts the behavioral and the mental, the behavioral and the psychological. So we're not just talking about the physiological here, we're talking about our behaviors will evolve and our mentality, our psychology will evolve as well. Now, this next idea is, in a way, an idea that a lot of people sort of think of as evolution. And this is the idea that was proposed by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and it's the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Okay, so this hypothesis is basically saying that physiological changes acquired over a life of an organism can be transmitted to their offspring. So we change to fit the environment and pass it on to the offspring. And I will say this is that for many years, I would always hear evolution talked about this way, is that we adapt, individuals adapt to the environment, and then we pass that on to our offspring. But again, evolution doesn't work that way. So what he's basically saying is, if you are someone who decides that you're going to start working out and you go to the gym every single day and you're working on weights and you develop strong muscles and you do that and you have these strong, very powerful muscles, and then eventually you get married and you still have this strong, powerful physique, and you decide that you're going to now have some children, that the idea is that those changes that you've acquired during that lifespan of working out can then be transmitted to your offspring so that they will have a better chance of being strong themselves. That's the basic premise here. And we know that that is not exactly the way evolution works. Okay, so the evolution does not work this particular way. We do not change to fit the environment as an individual, and then those changes that we do have are not transmitted then to our offspring. So it doesn't work that way. So how does it work? Well, we have to go to Darwin to really explain it to a certain extent. And Darwin's contribution was not about evolution per se. It was more about what is the process of evolution, what makes evolution sort of work in a way. And so this process is natural selection. Natural selection is the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. So what this does not say is that the organisms are adapting during their lifespan to that environment. All this is really saying is that organisms which happen to be better adapted to their environment are the ones which are going to survive long enough in order to produce offspring. Now, the basis of this is going to be the following: normal variations. When we are born, we're not born just like every single other person here. We have differences. We have variations within the species. Some of us will be shorter, some of us will be taller. Some of us will be stronger, some of us will be weaker. Okay, some of us will have perfect eyesight, some not so much. So these variations. All right, I've just been told by my system that I'm having problems with my headset here. Can you still hear me? Just someone chat a message to me that you still can hear me. Okay, good. All right, so these normal variations within the species are the key. That because we're not all exactly the same, we have variety. That what basically means, based on variations, some of the species are going to be more successful than other members of the species. Okay, so those members of the species who happen to have the right types of variations that allow them to be successful in that particular environment, they will live long enough so that they can have offspring. Okay, so the offspring will then inherit characteristics of their parents. And some of those characteristics they will inherit from their parents will be the characteristics that made their parents very successful in the survival game. So that is what is meant. And therefore, those organisms, those members of the species that did not inherit those particular characteristics, they may not live long enough to have sufficient numbers of offspring. And their offspring, which inherit those bad characteristics, will not live long enough to have more offspring. Therefore, their numbers start to dwindle until they're gone. Therefore, what you have is evolution. You now have a group of individuals, a species that have certain characteristics, and other characteristics have been, in a way, selected out of the gene pool. So what they mean by natural selection is this: nature is the one who gets to decide who's going to win. The nature is going to select the winners and the losers, because the nature sometimes will change the environment. And however that environment changes, only the organisms that have the right variation of characteristics will be the ones that will survive long enough to have offspring. So evolution is going to be due to natural forces of cause and effect, not actions of a deity. Variation is an engine of change. Okay, so what they're communicating here is that it's all about variety. That's why it is when you have organisms that have a very restricted gene pool. Okay, and that's why one of the reasons, among others, why it is that we don't like to see close relations marry and have children, is that there's less variety in the gene pool, and they may be more susceptible to things, less healthy, less well. So variation allows us to be more robust and allows some of the organisms to survive drastic changes in the environment, as an example. So this notion of essentialism is the view that for any specific entity, there is a set of attributes which are necessary to its identity and to its function. Something that aids you in your survival, something that is essential to your function as well as your identity. So the notion here is that what we see in these following slides is saying what is the true engine of the process of natural selection, which is the true process of evolution itself. Okay, so moving on. We now talk about the organism and its environment. Experience of surroundings, our ability to experience our surroundings, and differentiation between self and the environment. So you know that you are separate from the environment and you can experience, be aware of your surroundings. This can result in self-consciousness. You know that there is a self and that you know that you are different from the things around in your environment. This self relies on experience and knowledge of the environment. Okay, so experience of surroundings and differentiation between self and environment results in self-consciousness. Okay, and this self relies on us knowing, experience, and having knowledge of the environment. Now, this gets to another idea, one called animal environment mutuality. The view that we can only understand the psychology of an organism in relation to its surroundings. So in order to know an organism, you need to know its environment. You need to understand its environment. Now, what this is sort of based on to some extent is that the environment acts upon the organism. The organism adapts. It sort of suggests a sort of deterministic perspective. Okay, so the environment acts upon the organism adapts to it. Okay, so a couple of ideas about this. William James, who we'll see a little bit later, he disagreed with this notion of how the organism adapts. Basically, in this idea of deterministic perspective. And remember what determinism is that everything is already laid out. There's no variation. Things are the way they are for a specific reason. So what William James is saying here is that he disagreed with this deterministic perspective, because what he saw, okay, and we'll see more about William James later, is that autonomy is essential. Autonomy is essential for us to be able to take advantage of these variations. Okay, so an organism needs to be able to act in ways. It needs to have the autonomy to do things so that it can exercise its variations, its differences from other members of its species. Therefore, the organism must act upon the environment. All right. So, just a few ideas out there. Now, a summary on a few of these perspectives. Herbert Spencer, uh, organism reflects the truth of relations that the environment imposes. So here we're seeing the environment sort of imposing, and the organism reflects what it has to do in order to survive that environment. William James, the organism is active, an active role in making relations with the environment. Again, that's where that autonomy becomes very essential, that you need to have some say in what you're going to do in order to take advantage of those type of variations. And the organism is going to be changed by the environment and changes the environment. So that's another idea, is that the organism is changed by the environment, but also it changes the environment as well. Now, in the lecture, we talk about the earthworms. I won't go over that conversation again, but please review that in the lecture notes as well, about how the earthworm changes the environment and is changed by the environment. Okay, so now looking at Darwin and consciousness, we're going to review and go back a little bit to our friend Rene Descartes, just to remember some of the ideas that he offered to us, and then compare it to Charles Darwin. All right, first of all, remember, animals are machines, and we are machines, mechanical. Okay, and he made a distinction between us human machines and animal machines, and you may recall that. Okay, and what he basically stated was this: they feel pain and have basic sensations, but there was no intelligent thought. Remember, intelligent thought here to a large extent was seen as souls. So humans have souls, animals don't. All right, so this intelligent thought is a property of rational non-material, the human mind, not animals. So remember what Darwin was not Darwin, but what Descartes was saying. He wanted to mechanize the universe and was basically saying that we're all mechanical, we're all mechanized in some way to greater or lesser extents. Okay, and that's how he wanted to see the world. Now, Charles Darwin, he saw that the mind was part of the natural world, unlike what Rene Descartes says here. And he communicated to this idea that earthworms exhibit adaptive and flexible behavior. All right, and they have no real sense of the environment through senses, but they're not, behavior is not mechanical, but illustrates sort of an intelligent flexibility, flexibility of behavior. And so he was using that earthworm example to sort of communicate this idea of some sense of intelligence in nature or with animals. Now, obviously, the one thing that will sort of give us a better perspective of this, some struggle with the idea of having this type of consciousness in animals. Do they possess what we call self-awareness like humans do? Now, let me ask you this question. I have a house full of animals here, but you can chat me or send a text message here. Do dogs show, or that should be show, not so, do dogs show guilt or shame? If you've been around any dogs, just go ahead and send me a message whether or not you think dogs show guilt or shame. Has anyone ever owned pet? Oh, okay, some more responses. Okay, so most of you that responded do see that there is some sort of perspective that we have, that they do show, or at least what we interpret as some sort of guilt or shame when they've been caught doing something. That sort of suggests that they are self-aware, like we humans are. Now, Jean Romain basically said this: continuity between species. All aspects of mental life are not to be restricted to humans. And so the notion here is that they've opened up the possibility that we can see animals be a little bit more than what Renee and others may thought about them. So that's one of the things too that we see here. The idea that this consciousness, this self-awareness, and those types of mentality may also exist in animals as well. It's not restricted solely to humans. Okay. Now, just comparing a couple of ideas that we've seen previously to some of the ideas suggested by the evolutionary views. So looking at the evolutionary approach to psychology, so to speak. So evolutionary views. To understand the mind, you must understand its relationship to environment. Cartesian views, or the views that were proposed by Descartes, he basically would state the mind is separate from the environment, and knowing the environment does not aid in understanding the mind. All right, going back to evolutionary views, the mind is part of nature and is found throughout the animal kingdom to various degrees. Cartesian view, the mind is not part of nature. So he was not part of the mechanism that is he saw everywhere else. The mind is active. Cartesian view sees the mind as passive. Nature is not a machine. Nature is mechanistic. And the characteristic of nature is the absence of mind. Thinking things are not machines, not disembodied mind. The mental world is a part from the physical world. So again, as we go back and look and remember the ideas about dualism, that was his whole point, is that there was a separation between the physical realm and the mental realm. Okay, so those two things were kept apart. Whereas in the evolutionary view, as we've seen in the previous slides here, that line is not so solid anymore. We see that there is some crossover potentially. So thinking things fuse the mental and the physical. And what we see here from the Cartesian view, the external world is mechanistic, and the internal world, mind, operates on reason or rationality. And then we have finally the organic perspective, which basically is a physiological foundation, and the mechanistic perspective. So what we see here is just putting side by side these two sort of differing views. So just wanted to go back to look at what we talked about during our conversation on Rene Descartes and how it sort of compares to some of the ideas that were presented here in this particular information. All right, a few more slides here. So looking at, by way of a little bit of a review of some of the other information that was sort of covered. So one of the things that we need to understand is that before Darwin, there were individuals who had a lot of ideas about evolution. And we saw a few of them mentioned earlier, from Aristotle to Buffon to Goethe. And here we also have Spencer. And so want to just touch base on a couple of ideas that Spencer promoted and its impact on the world, not just psychology, but the world in general. So Herbert Spencer wanted to apply his view of evolution to everything in the universe, human mind and society. So he saw evolution as being very ubiquitous, something that had an impact around the whole realm of things. So through evolution, differentiation occurs and systems become increasingly complex and move toward perfection. That's a key point there. I should have bolded that. The idea here is that what he believes is that evolution takes us to perfection. All right. We become more perfected the more that we evolve. So as we become increasingly complex, we move toward this ideal of perfection. So he applied evolutionary theory to selection of behavior and what was called the Spencer-Bain principle, which to a large degree, had a great deal of influence on Thorndike, which had an influence on Skinner. So basically, again, the Spencer-Bain principle, which I believe we mentioned earlier, proposed that the probability of a behavior occurring in the future is a function of whether it is followed by a pleasurable event or a painful event. And again, very much like what we saw with the law of effect from Thorndike, and very much the basic premise that we see operating under Skinner's operant conditioning, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a future chapter. So he went on to propose that these propensities for various behavioral responses could be passed on to offspring. Now, the key thing I want to cover with this is this. We've all heard of survival of the fittest. And this idea is that only the fit are going to be able to survive. And so he applied this notion of survival of the fittest, he applied it to societies. And that's what is meant by social Darwinism. Okay. And social Darwinism has been used to justify a whole variety of things: imperialism, racism, eugenics, social inequality. And it was popular in the past with a few major movements. We saw that the Nazis used, the Nazis who sort of took over Germany used this to a great extent in their rise to power. It was also a very popular social movement in the United States that peaked in the 1920s, in the 1930s. And some of you may be familiar with this, and I'll ask you to see if you do recall any of this. There were at least 32 U.S. states that passed laws that resulted, based on the social Darwinism ideas, passed laws that resulted in the forced sterilization of more than 60 some thousand Americans, including immigrants, people of color, unmarried mothers, and the mentally ill. The idea was that in order to achieve a more perfected society, we need to make sure that certain individuals were not going to reproduce. Now, some of these ideas would later be picked up by, I think it was Galton, the cousin of Spencer here, who was trying to work with things like intelligence tests to try to identify people who are undesirables or people who are going to be a drain on society. But these ideas of psychology and evolution here have been used in a very negative sense in the past. So there's a lot of negative connotations to it. I want to just pause there before we start wrapping things up and see if there's any more formal questions. Is anybody familiar with eugenics at all? I've heard of it before. Yes. Okay. And so what we see to a large extent is that societies, in their effort to attempt to become better societies, they can do some things that, on the surface look quite horrible. Okay, and are quite horrible, to be quite honest with you. But at the same time, these ideas of social Darwinism does have some impact in other areas of psychology too. You may have heard of the just world hypothesis. The just world hypothesis basically states that if someone has something bad happening to them, maybe it's because they deserved it. Okay, and so when you're out and about in town and you see someone who's panhandling, for example, your perspective on them and why they're in the condition that they're in is going to be determined to some extent by your view of the just world idea. A just world basically says that if somebody's down on their luck and living hand to mouth, so to speak, maybe because they're not a good person. So we see these things in other areas of psychology as well that will influence our behavior. But obviously, people who are very well-meaning, and we saw this in the previous chapter when we talked about the existentialist Kierkegaard about truth being subjective. But you have people also, we talked about this in another chapter as well, where people who are well-meaning and reputable, they have a different perspective as what is good and what our society needs. And so we have these people always sort of in conflict. But now that we look back at it, I assure you that probably in the 1920s and 30s, Some people thought maybe it wasn't such a bad idea that these things were being done. Okay, that's all that I wanted to cover for today when it comes to the major key topics and points that I wanted to address. So I'm going to leave it open for you guys to see if you have any questions or comments about any of this stuff. And I'll go ahead and just let you know that for our next unit or module, we'll be focusing on chapter 10 and 11. And chapter 10 will cover our friend Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. And then chapter 11 will look at Wundt and the birth of experimental psychology. So we'll actually see psychology, the discipline born. So are there any questions or comments before we wrap things up? Okay, so I think we're good to go. So everyone have a great weekend, and try not to show up on CNN, because usually when you show up on CNN, it's not anything good. So I'll talk to you guys later. All right, bye-bye.